In the spring of 1220, on the outer edge of Old Carusa, a mother stood frozen as soldiers dragged her 14-year-old daughter toward a caravan of captives. The girl didn't fight. She knew resistance only sharpened the knife. Her name was Zarya, and by the time the ropes touched her wrists, her name had already been written into Mongol military ledgers. Her age, her build, the color of her eyes and hair, everything was recorded with the cold precision of a rising empire. Girls like Zarya were not a side effect of war. They were part of a plan. The Mongols weren't only taking cities. They were taking futures. Women's bodies were folded into an imperial logic where motherhood became a political resource. Official chronicles barely mentioned it, but its consequences lived on, in cultures, in family memories, and eventually in the genes of vast regions. This was conquest as biological and social integration, and those captive caravans of the 13th century were the first thread of a system that would echo for centuries. To see how it began, we have to go back to the Mongol steppe in 1162. A child named Temujin was born into a world where survival meant taking what others had before they took what you had. His clan was poor, pushed to the margins, constantly harassed by stronger tribes. When Temujin was 9, his father died, most likely poisoned by tribal enemies, and overnight his mother, Hoelun, was abandoned with several small children. They ate roots, raw fish, anything they could pull from the ground. Temujin learned early that the world divided into two kinds of people, those who take and those who are taken. At 16, his betrothed, Bort, was abducted by a rival tribe. He searched with a rage that burned for months. Along the way, he heard rumors that she had been raped, forced into another man's tent, perhaps killed. When he finally rescued her, Bort was pregnant. Was the child his or theirs? He could never truly know, but that night something locked into place. A cold, calculating understanding. Women were not only spoils of war, they were the future, and whoever controlled that future could remake the world. From that moment on, Temujin didn't build power only with warriors. He watched enemy tribes mourn for days. He saw men swallow shame and kill themselves after defeat. But women survived. They adapted. They gave birth to children who grew up remembering who had taken their mothers. In this order, Temujin didn't see weakness. He saw leverage. If he could control reproduction inside conquered peoples, he wouldn't have to garrison every valley forever. The people themselves would become Mongol from the inside. By 1206, when the Mongol tribes raised him as Great Khan, and he took the name Genghis Khan, that vision had turned into policy. Later, administrators would call it the permanent sowing system. It wasn't a philosophy. It was a protocol, and it had already begun with small, ruthless trials. The first truly systematic campaign came in 1209 against the Tangut Kingdom. The Mongols did not arrive as a mindless horde. They came with scribes, administrators, and doctors versed in female anatomy. Weeks before the siege began, spy teams slipped into Tangut cities to conduct secret censuses. How many women? What ages? What physical traits? What family lineages? They wrote it all onto parchment rolls, records that would become some of the earliest industrial paperwork of mass sexual violence. When the first Tangut city fell, the population was separated with surgical precision. Men were executed or enslaved. Women were divided into reproductive categories. Primary producers ages 14 to 30, no visible deformities. Secondary producers, ages 31 to 40, already mothers, usable but considered lower value. Everyone else, girls under 14, women over 40, the sick, was marked as discard. The first two categories were inked at the wrist and assigned to special caravans that followed the army. The third group simply disappeared. These reproductive caravans moved behind the main forces in wagons built for this purpose, rolling cages with interior compartments, separating women by pregnancy status, newly captured in one section, confirmed pregnancies in another, recent births in a third, and a fourth for those deemed infertile, quietly held for disposal. The caravans were a moving system, a factory on wheels. They never stopped for long, always staying close enough to the front to be fed by new conquests. Mongol doctors developed methods to increase fertility rates, herbs to trigger ovulation, strict diets to keep bodies strong enough for repeated pregnancies, even crude surgical interventions when something threatened output. Women were not treated as human beings. They were treated as reproductive stock that had to be kept functional. If war was a machine, these caravans were its hidden engine, turning stolen lives into imperial continuity. What made the system more terrifying than its violence was its bureaucracy. Every assault was noted, every pregnancy recorded, every birth classified by physical traits to decide whether a child would be raised as Mongol or killed. Administrators created tattooed number codes on women's wrists, an identity that recorded tribal origin, reproductive history, and estimated future value. A woman lost her name the day she was taken. She became a line in a ledger, a unit in a calculation. Some tried to cling to identity by whispering their real names to their babies before those babies were taken. Others cut small wounds into their own skin to remember who they were. But the machine kept moving. In less than a generation, entire groups of women became ghosts of themselves. When, in 1211, Genghis Khan turned toward the Jin Empire in northern China, the system was refined and ready. The Mongols did not only conquer land, they conquered wounds. Campaign records describe numbers that feel impossible. In a single city, Zhongdu, more than 40,000 women of reproductive age were captured. By 1213, records speak of more than 100,000 women distributed through caravans stretching hundreds of kilometers behind the army. Women were no longer taken one by one. They were processed in bulk, as predictably as grain or horses. The caravans had internal phases: capture, classification, adaptation, a sterilized word for systematic assault, pregnancy, birth, reassignment. Babies were inspected at birth. Those who looked Mongol enough were separated and placed with Mongol families. The rest were killed. Resistance was met with specialized protocols. Women who starved themselves were force-fed. Women who tried to end pregnancies were watched and bound in the final months. Women who injured themselves to become infertile were kept alive long enough to be used as warnings. Mothers who killed their own babies to spare them another life of conquest were tortured until compassion itself became a kind of terror. Genghis Khan had built something beyond traditional warfare. He didn't want a conquest that could later be reversed or reclaimed. He wanted permanence. Every pregnancy in those caravans was a seed planted into the future, conquest that kept walking forward even after the army passed. Mongol administrative records preserved in Persian and Chinese archives show how massive the system became. By 1220, reproductive caravans stretched from Mongolia to Eastern Europe and included more than 200,000 women. The empire built logistics specifically for this purpose. Supply stations where reproductive units were inspected like livestock. Field hospitals designed for forced births. Sorting centers where officials decided each newborn's fate. The nightmare wasn't only what was done to women, it was how methodical it all was. Genghis Khan bureaucratized cruelty. He turned savagery into an efficient administrative routine. His scribes recorded each assault with the same meticulousness used for captured horses. His doctors experimented on fertility, the way his generals experimented with battlefield tactics. His planners calculated human production rates with the same coldness they used to count stolen gold. If you're trying to understand why this left such a visible mark in history, that's the answer. This wasn't random violence. It was a state machine. And yet, inside that machine, women found ways to resist, paths the Mongols couldn't fully map because they lived outside the paperwork. They passed knowledge through signs and escape routes, through methods to induce miscarriage, through ways to poison breast milk so infants could die without obvious signs. Some learned to quietly vomit after meals to weaken themselves enough to be labeled infertile. Others cut themselves carefully to invite infection and fever, hoping illness would break a pregnancy. the most painful resistance wasn't physical. It was emotional. Women arranged secret rituals to whisper the names of dead children, to keep alive the memory of who they were before capture, to preserve scraps of culture and lullabies murmured in the dark. They knew they might never leave the caravans alive, so they fought for something smaller but sacred, that their identity would not be completely erased. When, in 1219, Genghis Khan moved against the Khwarezmian Empire, the system reached its most refined form. The Mongols were no longer improvising. They had protocols for different cities, different cultures, different kinds of resistance. Their intelligence networks became real operations that catalogued women not only by age and body, but by family ties, skills, and emotional bonds, anything that could later be weaponized to break, will. Khwarezmian cities met something they had no language for. The Mongols didn't come only to loot, they came to harvest. In Bukhara, Samarkand, and Merv, women were separated from families with industrial precision. Mongol commanders had learned that keeping mothers beside small children during early adaptation made them more compliant, but also that separating them after 3 months shattered resistance permanently. Even the timing of grief had been studied, turned into policy. The system treated social classes differently. Noble women received special handling, raped by high-ranking officers, housed in slightly better tents, not out of mercy, but calculation. Mongol doctors observed that children born of elites carried traits that later made integration into Mongol aristocracy easier. Peasant women were processed in mass, valued for physical endurance and survival through repeated pregnancies under horrific conditions. By this stage, doctors weren't only maintaining fertility, they were trying to maximize it. They used herbal mixtures intended to trigger multiple ovulations to increase the chance of multiple births. They trained to recognize early pregnancy signs and created diets to reduce birth complications. The logic was ruthless. Every captured womb was a factory. The empire wanted the highest output possible. By 1220, the scale defies comprehension. Reports describe caravans organized with military precision, stretching along marches that lasted for days. Each phase had specialized divisions: capture, classification, adaptation, early pregnancy, late pregnancy, birth, nursing, postpartum recovery, and finally reassignment or elimination. Each division had its own guards, doctors, administrators, and rules. The caravans traveled with mobile infrastructure built for their purpose: birthing wagons functioning as traveling clinics, prison tents for different processing stages, even morgue wagons for disposing of the dead on the road. Behind their armies, the Mongols created moving cities of horror, shadows that processed human life with a grim efficiency that foreshadowed later industrial systems. But the most unsettling part of Genghis Khan's approach wasn't efficiency. It was permanence. He understood something few conquerors before him had grasped. Rape was temporary, but genetics could last forever. Every child born from those caravans carried the biological signature of conquest, and those children would have children, and those children would have children. Violence didn't end when the army rode away. It could reproduce itself for centuries. Modern genetics confirms how effective that was. Studies of Y chromosome lineages have suggested that around 16 million men alive today descend directly from Genghis Khan, or from his close male relatives. That's roughly 1 in every 200 men on Earth. In Mongolia, the number rises to around 8%. In parts of Central Asia, around 3%. Even in Eastern Europe, where Mongol occupation was shorter, markers appear in significant populations, but those numbers still don't tell the whole story. The system was never limited to Genghis Khan alone. His sons, grandsons, and generals inherited it and expanded it. Ogedei refined methods during the European campaigns. Monk applied them during wars against the Abbasid Caliphate. Kublai used them across China. What began as one-man strategy became an imperial doctrine, forced reproduction as a dynastic tradition. Then 1227 came. During another campaign against the Tangut, Genghis Khan died. The caravans behind his armies already stretched thousands of kilometers across Eurasia. His death didn't end the system, it sealed it. His heirs saw it as part of the imperial inheritance. Captured women were redistributed among Mongol princes like inherited cattle. Babies born from the caravans were raised to serve future expansion. Protocols became operational manuals for the next wave of conquest. Genghis Khan's official funeral was marked by a grim spectacle. 40 young virgins were buried alive with his body. But that was only the visible ritual. The real offering was hidden in the shadows. Thousands of women in the caravans were executed during the transition of power to prevent escape or rebellion. Their bodies thrown into mass graves that archaeologists in modern times are only beginning to uncover. Graves arranged with the same bureaucratic order that defined the system. Archaeologists excavating Mongol-era sites find evidence that matches written records. Mass graves of young women in areas separate from fallen warriors. Skeletons showing chronic malnutrition. Badly healed fractures. And the wear of forced transport. Bones of infants and small children buried without the ritual markers typical of Mongol tradition. When official chronicles fall silent, even the earth remembers, near ancient Bukhara, researchers uncovered something that reached back to Zarya. A woman and an adolescent girl were buried side by side. DNA analysis showed they were mother and daughter. Isotope testing suggested the mother was local, but the girl had traveled great distances before death. Even without names, the story is clear. A family broken. A child dragged across empires, buried in foreign soil. And that is the core of what Genghis Khan built. Not only an army that conquered cities, but a system that conquered bloodlines. The caravans were more than prisoner trails. They were moving blueprints for reshaping populations. Every ledger entry, every tattooed number, every newborn taken or killed was a brick in an architecture of power that didn't stop at borders. It reached into the future itself, because long after the fires died and Mongol banners vanished from the horizon, children born in those caravans grew up inside the conquered lands. Some were raised fully as Mongols. Some were raised locally, but their veins carried Mongol lineage. Over generations, the difference blurred. Entire regions were stitched into the empire, not only by law and tribute, but by descent. That's why this system matters when we talk about legacy. Genghis Khan's greatest weapon wasn't only the mounted archer or the siege machine. It was the deliberate conversion of reproduction into state governance. He turned motherhood into machinery, violence into inheritance, and conquest into something that could outlive him by centuries. And if you want to understand the last echo of that machine, how it spread, how it changed the map of human lineage, how the secret resistance of the women trapped inside it shaped what survived, then you have to look at what happened after his death. When Genghis Khan was gone, the empire didn't stop to mourn. It reorganized. Princes gathered not to ask whether the system should continue, but how it would be divided. The woman caravans, already moving like a second army, were treated as inherited property. The strongest sons and grandsons took the largest shares. Generals who proved loyal were rewarded with reproductive units as if they were herds. In the Mongol view, this was not a moral question. It was infrastructure. When the architect dies, you don't dismantle the infrastructure, you expand it. So the caravans kept rolling. Under Ogedei Khan, the system was written into formal imperial law. It became more standardized, and in some regions even more brutal. The conquest of Eastern Europe wasn't only a march of fire and steel, it was also the march of classified bodies. The protocol followed the same steps: intelligence networks ahead of the army, secret censuses in towns that didn't even know they'd been targeted. Then the split. Men killed or enslaved. Women separated by reproductive category. Branded, numbered, shoved into wagons behind the front. Later, Monka expanded the doctrine in the Middle East. When Mongol armies moved toward Baghdad, the same machine moved with them. In Iran, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus, captured women fed every region of the system. Kublai Khan later applied it across China at such a scale that even Mongol administrators struggled to measure it. What started as one man's strategy became a crowned habit, passed down like a throne, and for decades that habit reshaped Eurasia. You can see it in genetics, yes, but also in culture. In parts of Central Asia and China, legends still persist about riders who took girls and foreign-eyed children. Some stories are told as warnings. Others have been turned into pride, because sometimes that is what survival requires. In some villages, families quietly preserved songs and oral histories about women who never returned, daughters dragged beyond the horizon. In others, people stopped speaking of it entirely. Silence can be a kind of inheritance too. But here is what matters. The permanence Genghis Khan imagined did not unfold cleanly. Real life never does. The empire wanted biology to flow in one direction, from conquered to Mongol. But people are not clay. People resist in ways armies cannot predict. Even under tight control, women found cracks. Some lived long enough to raise children who remembered the language their mothers whispered. Some passed down old gods, old kinships, old lullabies that carried home. A child taken into a Mongol family might grow up speaking Mongolian, riding as a Mongol, fighting as a Mongol. And still, somewhere in the chest, a half-remembered name could survive. A ghost identity that wouldn't die. Others, those of mixed lineage raised locally, became bridges between worlds, carrying the empire inside them, but not fully belonging to it. And through those scattered human paths, the system produced something the Mongols could never fully govern. Mixed populations with mixed loyalties. The empire planted seeds, yes, but seeds don't all become the same tree. They mix with the soil. They bend with weather. They become forests no planner intended. Still, the scale of the machine made its trace unavoidable. By the middle of the 13th century, Mongol lineages had spread so widely that later empires couldn't untangle them. The sons of the caravans entered new wars, took new captives, founded new dynasties. Some rose into Mongol nobility. Some became governors in conquered provinces. Some simply disappeared into the countryside, their descendants diluted over generations, until only a genetic trace remained. That's why, centuries later, modern scientists found what they found. When researchers mapped Y chromosome patterns across Asia, they weren't searching for the ghost of Genghis Khan, and yet there he was, a signature too widespread to be explained by ordinary historical growth, a lineage that exploded across continents in only a few generations. This wasn't magic. It was politics, logistics, the industrialization of reproduction, but focusing only on the Khan's descendants can hide a deeper horror. The true scale was not a single bloodline. It was many. Generals, princes, soldiers, tens of thousands of men gained reproductive access through conquest. If you imagine each caravan as a river, the empire was a full delta, pouring Mongol lineage into the future through countless channels. The genetic footprint was not one man's shadow, it was an imperial storm, and storms leave debris history cannot gather back. As the empire fractured into khanates, the system did not disappear. It adapted. In some places, Mongol-controlled local rulers copied it because it worked. In others, it shifted into tribute systems, where conquered communities were forced to gift women to Mongol elites to avoid greater violence. Even where the violence softened, the core logic remained. Women's reproduction was territory. Over time, some khanates began to settle, building cities, collecting taxes instead of only raiding. That slow shift reduced the need for mobile caravans, but it did not end the consequences. The children already born had become a demographic reality, and demographic realities do not rewind. So what does this mean for Zarya, the girl at the beginning? It means her story was repeated so many times it became part of the human map. We don't know whether she survived, whether she gave birth, whether her child was taken, whether she died on the road. But we do know this. Millions of people alive today carry the genetic and cultural consequences of girls like her, and that forces a harder kind of understanding. When people talk about Genghis Khan's legacy, they often focus on battlefield genius, reopened trade routes, the speed of conquest, the way the Mongols connected distant worlds. All of that is real, but it's incomplete Behind the wars was another architecture, rarely named, a system that saw motherhood as a weapon, a policy that aimed not only to defeat enemies, but to biologically rewrite them. That's why facing this history feels so disturbing. It isn't a story with a clean ending. There's no moment where victims are freed, where justice rides in on horseback. The empire faded, then fractured, then vanished as an institution. But its trace remained inside people. You can walk through modern Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, parts of Russia, Mongolia, northern China, even sections of Eastern Europe, and see faces that carry faint echoes of that era. That doesn't mean those people are Mongol. Identity isn't a blood test. It means history moves not only through books and monuments, but through bodies, and women's bodies were the road. The archaeologists who uncovered those graves near Bukhara weren't only finding bones. They were finding proof of a hidden empire inside the empire. The woman and daughter buried together were never meant to be remembered. The system depended on that, turning people into numbers, then into dust, but memory resists erasure. Every mass grave is an argument against silence. Every genetic marker is a reminder that conquest has consequences beyond maps. Every lullaby that survived as a whisper is proof that even beneath the most ruthless machine, the human spirit can slip through cracks. So when you look at the Mongol Empire, what you are really seeing is two conquests layered on top of each other. One made of land and law, visible to everyone, and one hidden in wagons behind the army. And reproductive conquest carried into the future through children drafted into an empire without consent, through ink on women's wrists. The first conquest ended. The second is still with us. And that is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. Genghis Khan didn't only try to control the world. He tried to control what the world would be after him, not by building monuments, but by turning human reproduction into state policy, planting conquest inside the next generation, making victory something that could reproduce. Zaria's mother watched in 1220 as her daughter vanished into a caravan. She had no power to stop it. But the system that swallowed her daughter was never only about that moment. It was about centuries. It was about the future being drafted into an empire without its consent. And even now, we still live with the echo of that choice.